Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to be covering some of the basics of Photoshop. I'm aware that most of you already have experience in Photoshop to some degree, but hopefully this will be kind of a more formal introduction. We'll go over the basics of the tools that you really need to know to be as fast and efficient as you can be in the software. You don't need to know everything. I've been using Photoshop for years, and I'm sure there's still things I don't know or use very often. But we'll cover the basics and make sure that you're ready to go. We'll be talking about what's called a non-destructive workflow. So we'll talk about that in a second, but basically just making sure that we're carrying information forward instead of kind of going in and bluntly like deleting all the pixels all the time. So to start with, we're just going to play around with like an example image. I'm going to be using this picture of the Negakin capsule tower, which is sadly being demolished in Tokyo as we speak, if it's not already gone. But I'm just going to be using this second image that comes up here from Google Images. So if you want to follow along, you're welcome to do that. So I'll get started. I'll just drag and drop that into Photoshop in a new document. So I'll just drag it from my downloads here. I'm a big drag and drop person. I like that it opens up a new file exactly to the dimensions of whatever image you've brought in. So you don't really have to adjust anything if you like the size of that image. Again, you might remember from our very first class, if you want to check the size or dimensions of that image, you can come up to the image tab up at the top here, and then click on image size. That's going to tell you the width and height. Mine is currently set to inches. Yours might be in pixels. I think inches is a nice legible dimension. And then it's going to show you the resolution. So resolution is something important to keep an eye on. Again, we talked about in first class. If you're developing an image for a digital presentation, 150 pixels per inch is going to be great, kind of a nice minimum. And then if you're doing something that you're going to be printing out, you're going to want to set that number to 300. So when you're changing the resolution in Photoshop, it's not actually improving the resolution or adding more information to this image. It's not going to bump up the quality, but it's just going to play with that density of dots and kind of resize the image that you're working with. So I'm going to cancel this. I'm going to leave this image at the size that it is. It's fine. I'm not printing this, so I'll hit cancel and it's good to go. First things first, we're going to take a look at the toolbar up on the left-hand corner here. This is where most of the operations that you're going to be doing are going to come from. Again, you might remember from last class, everything else going on in Photoshop is over on the right-hand side here for the most part. We'll have some properties that show up top here. We'll keep an eye on that in the future once we start making some adjustments. And then down in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got our layers. So layers are super important. Everything in Photoshop happens in layers that are stacked on top of each other like pancakes. Right now you can see the image that we have is brought in as a background layer. So anytime you open up an image directly in Photoshop, it's going to bring it in as a background layer. So that means that it is brought in with this little lock icon. Again, you'll probably remember from first class, if we hover over it, we can see that it indicates the layer is partially locked. So if I go to click on it and move it around, it's going to give me an error and tell me I need to unlock that layer. So you can either check yes on this convert to normal layer option here. You can either accept that, or you can just come over to this little layer and click on the little lock icon so that it disappears. So again, you can just click on the little like lock icon, and now I'm able to click and drag that around however I like. Anytime you have kind of an empty space in Photoshop, you can see you'll get this classic Photoshop checkerboard pattern start to show up in behind. So that lets you know that there's nothing there. If I go to export this image, you won't actually see that checkerboard background. It's just kind of a symbol to let you know that there's nothing, and it's going to export probably black. So I've got my image, I can start to move it around, and we can come up to some of the tools on the left-hand side of our toolbar here. The one up at the top is the Move tool. So this is very super basic. You're going to use it for everything. You can use your mouse just to click and drag the layer around. And you can also use the Move tool while you have the Move tool selected, just to start to click and drag the corners of that image to resize it. So by default, the proportions of that image should be constrained. So what that means is that when I click one of these corners and drag it around, the proportions of the image are going to stay the same. It's not going to get all funky and distorted. If I hold down Shift though, then I should be able to resize it however I want. So I can make it super wide or super tall. Again, just by holding down Shift while I'm resizing that image. But again, by default, it should be locked to the same proportions, which is pretty useful. If you're using an older or cracked version of Photoshop, those commands might be inverted, so just pay attention to that. Once you've resized the image or moved the image, a lot of the time it won't actually accept that you've done that until you press this little checkbox up at the top here. You have to quote unquote commit transform. And you can do that by either checking the little checkbox or hitting enter on your computer. After that, you'll be able to go forward and make new commands. But if you don't accept the changes, you won't be able to kind of like go in and do other things until you kind of like accept those or commit those changes that you want to make. Something else to note, so these transform controls that we can get at just by kind of clicking and dragging these little handles in the corners. There's another way to play with these corners a little bit differently, and that's using a free transform. So instead of just clicking and dragging these corners, if you instead on a PC hit Control or on a Mac press Command, you should be able to see that that little mouse in the corner, oh sorry, actually it might be Alt on a PC. I forget. I'm on a Mac, so I might make some little slip ups, but it's either Control or Command. And when you take a look at that mouse hovering over one of these little corner handles, your mouse should turn from an arrow icon into a white arrow or white cursor. So again, either Control or Alt on PC, don't remember, or Command on a Mac. And then you should be able to grab that corner and click and drag it and just move that one corner around. And it might seem kind of weird right now, but this is actually super helpful when we're trying to play with materials in an image or just like change the perspective of an image in a collage. It's really nice to be able to hit Command and click and drag just those individual corners of an image to play with the shape of it as needed. Again, you're going to have to commit those changes if you want to. In this case, I'm going to say no, no thank you. I don't want to make those changes actually. So you can hit cancel transform up at the top here or just escape. The next tool we're going to talk about is the one right below it. This is the marquee tool. You're probably quite familiar with this one in the software or other softwares. Basically just lets you make a selection. By default, it's set to a rectangle. So when I click on this tool, and I click and drag, it gives me this little dashed rectangle over the image. Now I have selected that part of the image and I can start to play around with it if I like. If we go back up to the move tool, you can see that now when I have that piece selected, I'm just moving that one piece of the image, which is kind of nice. So that's the marquee tool. Marquee tool lets you just like select rectangular areas of the image. If you want to grab the move tool again, you can also just press V instead of having to come up to the top and click this icon up at the top. You can just press the letter V on your keyboard, and then you have the move tool selected. You can also select other shapes, so it doesn't have to just be a rectangle. If you right click on this little toolbar here, you can see there's a couple of different tools that have a tiny little triangle in the bottom right hand corner of the icon. So you can see this rectangular marquee tool. There's a tiny little triangle in the right hand corner. That just means if you right click on it, there's a couple other options for that tool. So in this case, we also have the elliptical marquee tool. So if you want to select a circle shape, you can right click on the icon and select elliptical marquee tool instead. And this is useful like if we want to select one of these windows that we have going on here. There's a window with a creepy little face on it. Maybe I'll select that one. I can use the elliptical marquee tool to select in a circle shape, and then I can move that piece around or delete it or whatever I want to do. So good to know you've got a circular option there. That one, if you click on it, you can make any kind of like oval shape, just any sort of like round shape. But if you want a perfect circle, you just have to hold down Shift while you're doing it, and then you'll get a nice perfectly circular shape every time. So Shift is going to give you a perfect circle. If you have a selection and you want to go do something else and you don't want that selected anymore, Photoshop really hangs on to that selection. It doesn't want to let it go. So um, if you want to go back and click something else, even if you click away, it's still going to have that selection going. Um, you will be aware because you'll see this flashing dashed line. So it should be pretty obvious when you have something selected. But if you've made a mistake and you don't want to have it selected anymore, you unfortunately can't just press escape or anything to get out of it. You have to deselect. So you have to basically undo your selection by deselecting. And you can do that either by pressing the deselect button on this little floating bar that's going to pop up for you sometimes. So when you have something selected, you're going to get this little floating menu with a couple different options. And we'll talk about that in a hot second. But for now, just know that there's a deselect option there. So I can press deselect there, and now that kind of flashing circle is gone, and I can go back to doing whatever I want across the image. But another shortcut, and probably the one I use most frequently, is just either Control or Command D. So that's a nice little shortcut to deselect and move on and work with something different. Another popular way to select stuff inside of Photoshop so that you can start to work it is the polygonal lasso tool. Lasso? I don't know. Lasso tool. It is the one directly under the marquee tool. It's just kind of this like pointy line icon. You can also get to it just by pressing L. So as you use Photoshop more, you'll get more comfortable with the shortcuts. But just press L to get to this polygonal tool. And this basically just gives you exactly what it sounds like. It's a little lasso, yeehaw. So you can kind of click and select whatever you're interested in and get that same kind of selection that you can then start to work with and play around with. It works with straight lines, so polygonal meaning a series of straight lines. And you can just click to place another point. Click, click, click. If you ever want to make a perfectly straight line, again, you just have to press Shift. So once you press Shift, it's going to lock it to either the X-axis, so the horizontal dimension, if your mouse is moving that way, or the up and down axis, if your mouse is kind of like closer to that up, down, Y axis. So Shift is going to lock your tool to a perfectly orthogonal orientation. In order to finish using the polygonal lasso tool, you'll see that it just kind of keeps going infinitely. You need to get back to the point at the start where you started making a selection. You'll know that you're there because there's a tiny little circle that shows up right next to your lasso cursor. So if you look at your cursor, there's an icon for the lasso, and then there's a tiny little circle that shows up when you've kind of reached that starting point again, and the selection is going to close. So you need to close it in order to like stop doing it, basically. So once you close that loop, now you have a nice selection you can work with. If you don't do that, this is kind of the danger of using the lasso tool, and I've done this too many times to count, unfortunately. You'll like make a painstaking selection, you'll spend like 5 minutes cutting something out, the perfect shape, not this example, and then something will happen, you'll hit escape by mistake, or you'll, I don't know, just bump your mouse or something and like make a bad selection, or like make one bad click, and you can't undo, unfortunately. Like once you've made a click, you can't undo your most recent click. So just pay in mind, you might want to take it in smaller chunks. So if you're doing kind of like a really detailed selection, you might want to take little breathers, little breaks, so that you can kind of like undo certain parts if you've made some mistakes. So for example, I've just selected this little top piece. If I want to keep selecting, I just have to press Shift. So once I hold down Shift, you can see that now there's a little plus next to my cursor. That means that anything I select is going to be added to that current selection. So I can keep adding cubes, close that loop, and now that new selection is added to the one I had in the first place. So again, holding down Shift, you're going to add to your selection. Vice versa, if you want to remove something from your selection, let's say that last little piece wasn't my best work. On a PC, you're going to hit Alt, and you should see that there's a little minus button that shows up. On a Mac, that's going to be Option. So again, just take a look at your cursor. You'll see that there's a little minus button that shows up next to your lasso icon. And now when you click and make a selection from here with that minus icon on, it's going to subtract it from your selection. So again, Shift to add stuff, boop, 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 and Alt or Option to take it away. And that's kind of a better way to go piece by piece, because then you can Control Z to undo it, or Control Shift Z to redo it. That's Command on a Mac. So that's one way to select stuff in Photoshop. That's going to be a tool you'll use quite frequently. If you right click on that one again, there's a couple other options. I haven't really used the selection brush tool. I think that's just kind of like painting on this pink substance, and then that's going to make a selection for you somehow. I'm not super sure how that one works. I haven't really used it. But the lasso tool, instead of polygonal one, this just regular lasso tool is nice for when you are just grabbing kind of a loosey-goosey shape. This one's not straight lines. It is just loose, blobby, whichever way your mouse goes. Again, same rules apply. If you hold down Shift, you'll be able to get some, add to your selection, and then Option is going to let you subtract from your selection. If you ever want to, let's say that you are using the polygonal lasso tool and you are cutting out a shape and you need to close the loop, but you're not sure actually where you started it. You're like, oops, don't know where it is. I can't find it. I'm not super sure where it started. You can press the Command button on a Mac. I think it's going to be Control on a PC. And when you click next, so let's say I'm going to place my next click here, you can see that that little close icon shows up when I press Command or Control. And so when I do that, once I click, it's going to automatically close that loop. So it makes that little extra section in there, and it'll close the loop for you. So you don't have to worry about like, oops, where was that initial selection? I'm actually not sure. So those are how you kind of manually select parts of your image. Moving down to these next few different tools. So I'm going to right click on this little paintbrush icon here. And here we have the Magic Wand tool, Quick Selection tool, and Object Selection tool. So you might be familiar with the Magic Wand tool. This one down at the bottom here, the icon is a magic wand, very cute. So this one, if you click in your image, you can see what it's doing is selecting pixels that it thinks are the same. So it's going through your picture and it's looking shape by shape, and it is basically running an algorithm to try to guess which shapes and colors go together, like which pixels belong. And you can control the tolerance up here. So this number under tolerance is going to control how much of a kind of search range it's really working with, or how different can those pixels be from one another before it doesn't select them anymore. So you can see if I make this number really small, like 1, and then try to select, I'm only getting really, really tiny pieces of the image because it's only looking for pixels that are within 1 unit of similarity to the ones next to it. Whereas if I make this number really big, like 100, then when I go to select, it's selecting like almost everything because its boundaries for what it defines as like similar or what looks similar is super loose. So this one I find can be helpful in certain circumstances when you're really trying to select a specific shape or like really, really clearly defined patch of color. But otherwise it seems to be a little bit too finicky for me. It's not quite general enough. So instead, my favorite one to use is actually the Quick Selection tool. I use this one all the time. Again, if you want to deselect something that you've selected, just press the little deselect down here or hit Control or Command D. So instead, with the Quick Selection tool, this one is a little bit smarter than the Magic Wand tool. Instead of looking for like identical or self-similar pixels, Now it's looking for shapes. It's trying to understand like what geometries seem like they would go together. So you can see now when I'm making a selection, it's kind of grouping things a little bit more logically. It seems to be pulling out those little cubes a little bit more clearly. And so that's why I really like the quick selection tool. It is a little bit smarter than the magic wand. Not super sure exactly how it works, but I think it just tries to understand from the image what shapes logically go together. Same deal with these kind of magic wands and selection tools. If you want to add to your selection, you're going to want to hit shift to kind of keep growing that selection, make it bigger and bigger. And if you want to subtract, you're going to have to hit alt or option to kind of deselect from parts of that selection that you have made. So quick selection tool I really like. You can play with the size up here, and that's going to give you a little bit more control over how much you're selecting at a time. So the size of the brush really that you're working with. But otherwise it doesn't really have that same tolerance. The last option that we have here is the object selection tool. So this one's new in Photoshop. If you're using again, a cracked version or an older version, it's probably not going to show up for you. This image isn't an amazing example. You can kind of see what it's doing, all this stuff that's turning hot pink. Photoshop is scanning the image and then using its AI to try to figure out what it thinks is an object. So again, not the best image. Maybe if we go to add in, maybe I'll add in like a little astronaut or something into this picture. We can find a different image to use that tool with, and I can kind of show you how it looks a little more clearly. So I'm just going to go to public work. Public.work is the web address, which is kind of an interesting new repository for open source images. So if you ever want to add some funny, goofy, old-timey open source images to your work, public work is kind of an interesting source. So maybe I'll add like an astronaut floating in the image. Cute! Pics from the Apollo mission. Maybe I'll use this one. I'll try to cut this little guy out of my image. The navigation on public work is kind of cool. It's just this like endless scrolling feed. Anyway, I'll download it from here. Pop back into Photoshop and click and drag my little astronaut in here. I'll check yes to accept it. Once you drag a new image in, you have to kind of commit that you want to bring that image in at that size. So I'll hit yes up at the top. You can see I've got a new layer here called public work image. It's great. So back to that object selection tool. Let's say I want to grab this little astronaut. This is a much better example. You can see when you have the object selection tool checked or selected, it's scanning that image, it's looking for quote unquote objects. And in this case, it's finding one in that astronaut, which is really nice. Again, this is new. It's getting better and better all the time because they're training it on their AI system. So keep an eye on this one. Even if it's shitty now, it's getting better for sure, day by day. So yeah, you can kind of toggle around your image, see what turns pink. I'm going to click my little astronaut and you can see it makes that selection for me. It looks really good, actually. It did a great job on this one. Another option you have instead of using the any of these necessarily, once you have kind of one of these tools clicked on, it doesn't really matter which one, but as long as you have a selection tool clicked, there's also this option up at the top here that says select subject. So that's doing something very similar to this select object tool, this object selection. It's scanning your image and it's trying to understand what it thinks the subject of that image is. If you hover over it, you can see it says creates a selection from the most prominent objects in the image. So we can click that as well. That's another nice little shortcut. Select subject. And you can see it's done the math and it's been like, okay, it's probably the astronaut. That's the subject of this image. That's kind of crazy. All this stuff is super new in Photoshop. There's a lot of really amazing AI stuff coming out inside of Photoshop. I know AI is really gimmicky and like a little scary, and there's issues with artistic attribution, and there's a lot of issues, but there's also some really fascinating stuff coming out, especially in Photoshop. So we'll touch on that a little bit more as well. But for now, select subject is really great. So now that we've got this little astronaut selected, you may be wondering, okay, we've done a lot of work selecting stuff. Why would we want to do that? So we can cut it out, basically. Photoshop is basically like a collage tool. When you think about it, it's pretty much like anything that you would back in the day have to do with like scissors and glue. Photoshop is going to be the tool for you. So in this case, when we want to cut out this astronaut, there's a couple different ways we can go about it. The first way that might come to mind for you is just like, okay, erase everything outside of it. And that's something that a lot of people do. They'll come over to the side and grab, I don't even know where the tool is, the eraser tool, or press E to get it, and start to kind of select everything outside of it. You'll get this image, depending how you brought the picture into Photoshop, that says this smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. So this is something we'll talk about next class. We'll talk about smart objects in Photoshop because it's good and useful to know. For now, we're just going to hit OK. You'll know something's a smart object when you see this little like picture icon on the thumbnail over in the Layers tab over on the right-hand side. It's just a different way of working with images and linking them into Photoshop. So don't worry about it right now. I'll just hit OK. You can see that little icon went away, so now it's just a normal layer. And now a lot of people will start to want to erase stuff outside of that selection. When you have something selected, you're only really working with what's inside of that selection. So if I go to erase stuff outside of it, nothing's going to happen. But I should be able to erase stuff inside of it. So that's not ideal. That's not what we want. We want to keep the astronaut and erase what's outside of it. So a quick shortcut to do that when you have something selected is Control on a PC, Command on a Mac. So Control or Command, Shift I. So Control Shift I or Command Shift I. And that is the shortcut for inverse. I think the actual menu option for that is inverse here under select. So up at the top, select, and then inverse. That's going to take whatever you have selected and give you basically the negative shape around it. So it's going to select exactly opposite what you have selected. So you can kind of toggle back and forth between the two. So my original selection here, and then Command Shift I. Now I have everything else selected. So now when I go in with my eraser tool, I should be able to like erase chunks of it. That's one way that people work. You can change the size of the eraser up here, so I can make the brush a little bit bigger so it's less painful to erase this piece by piece. That's one thing people do. Some people just hit delete. So once they have the inverse selected, they'll just hit delete. It'll delete everything outside of it. And now we have a little cutie astronaut floating around that we can resize and play with in our image. But other ways of working can be better for retaining what's called a quote unquote non-destructive workflow. So when we hit delete or we erase the pixels here, those pixels are gone forever. And sometimes that's totally fine, but other times it's actually kind of a problem that those pixels are gone. For example, like if we did kind of a bad job selecting the astronaut and want to make some changes, maybe we want to bring some of that information back. Sometimes it's really, really best to hang on to the image that you're pulling from instead of deleting those pixels, kind of keeping them there behind the scenes. In this case, it's really not that big of a deal because actually the selection is quite clean. And if we delete everything outside of it, we're pretty much good to go. We shouldn't really need to play with that original image very much. But there's going to be a lot of cases where maybe you'll be working with a more complex image that you're going to want to hang on to the rest of those pixels and basically just kind of hide them while you're not working with them so that you can come back to it later. And the way that we do that in Photoshop is with what's called a mask. So a mask in Photoshop you can get to in one of two ways. Well, I guess there's more, but the main, most accessible buttons are the one on this little floating tab here. So the mask icon is this little rectangle with a circle in the center. Create mask from selection. Or if you don't see this little floating bar, you can come down to the bottom right-hand corner under layers here and choose that same icon down at the bottom. When you hover over it, you should get a little preview of a dog. Cute. These little quick videos are actually super helpful. If anything's ever confusing you in Photoshop, they've really beefed up their like in software tutorials. So yeah, feel free to check these out. They're actually super helpful. Anyway, I'm gonna hit mask here and we'll see what happens. So I had the wrong selection selected. You can see I think I just had my little astronaut selected, and so it cropped him out of the pic. So I'll undo that, hit Control or Command Shift I to reverse it. So now I'm just selecting my little astronaut fella. I'll hit mask one more time, and now I have just my astronaut going on here. But you can see over on the right-hand side, the layer has started to look a little differently. I'm not super sure how to zoom in on that picture for you there. But you can see we've got our original thumbnail on the left-hand side. And now there's also a black rectangle that's been added to that layer with, you can kind of see in white the rough shape of the little astronaut that we've selected. So I'll show you a little diagram of what exactly is going on with a mask in Photoshop. So anytime you use a mask in Photoshop, it's basically taking the image that you have and using black and white paint on top of it to choose what's shown and what's hidden. So you can see in this example, they've got a layer mask on top of this picture where there's a kind of black shape painted on top of the image. And you can see everything that's black, everything that's under that black painted shape disappears from the image. So that's hidden. And then everything that's white is still shown. So that's exactly what's going on with our little astronaut. If we pop back into Photoshop, you can see everything that's black has been removed from the image. So everything outside of our astronaut has been removed, and everything that's in white is being shown. And you can play around with this using the brush tool in Photoshop. If I come up to the brush tool over on the left-hand side, or you can just press B. While I have that little layer mask selected, so not the thumbnail, we're not working with the thumbnail, but the actual layer mask, so that little black rectangle. If I start painting on top, right now I'm using black paint. You can tell from the little squares down at the bottom here, we've got black selected at the front. When I start painting on that layer mask, everything that I'm painting in black is erased from the scene. But if I have the reverse, so if I switch these foreground and background colors, so from black and white, if I click this little switcheroo button, or you can press X to swap between the two. When white is in front, so I'm painting with white, now that's added back into the scene. So the beauty of this and the reason that we recommend this kind of workflow is that those pixels are still there. So if you make a mistake or you fuck up in some way, you can go back and make little tweaks, little changes to bring things back. So I find this has kind of saved my ass quite a few times. And I think it's easier for other people to work with a lot of the time when you kind of retain some of those pixels. So you can go back and make changes at a later date. It's really great. I can play with the size of the brush that I'm working with from this little drop down at the top. So I'm going to crank up the size and add more of that astronaut back into the image. So I'm painting over in white the things that I want to keep, and painting over in black the things that I want to erase. So you can see now in that little thumbnail, you can see all of the white that I've painted into that image. We've ended up with this kind of like egg shape. That's all of the stuff we want to keep. And everything in black is what's kind of cropped out. So obviously this isn't ideal. I want to kind of reselect my little astronaut. So I'm going to use the object selection tool I'm going to click on him one more time. You can see I have the wrong thing selected. So it's doing a less good job of selecting my object when I have the layer mask selected. So it's trying to work with the black and white paint, which isn't ideal. I just want to go back to that image thumbnail, make sure that you're actually working on the image, and then I should be able to select the subject a little bit easier. So I can either delete this layer mask and start again, which we can do nice and easily. If I right click on it and hit delete layer mask, that mask is gone. We're back to our original image, and now I can make another mask nice and easily from this little toolbar here with just my astronaut selected. This is a good example where it didn't do an amazing job. It cut off his foot down at the bottom here, so I might want to go back in and paint in that foot with a little bit of white paint. There's also some really useful tools when you're working with masks that can be super useful if you're working with an image that isn't super clear cut with the boundaries. I found it really helpful with like trees and stuff if you're ever working with trees and plants. I found it really great to double click on this little layer mask. So I'm going to double click on this one. And that's going to bring up a whole different user interface here. This is the specifically for working with masks. And there's a couple different options that make it really helpful to really refine those edges and end up with a cleaner, more precise image. Right now you can see that it's kind of fading out the background. I find it helpful sometimes to change it to overlay here from this little drop down so you can see really clearly with super sharp red contrast exactly what you're getting. You can play with the opacity of how thick that mask is. It's just a preview, it's just showing you kind of what you're working with right now. And then these little sliders down here are really helpful for playing with exactly what's selected. So radius of trying to detect those edges is going to give you a slightly different selection. A bigger radius is going to be a little bit more bizarre. That's what it's choosing. Smooth is going to take those edges, and you can see it's just going to start to really like round all of the corners and give you a slightly smoother, rounder selection versus the sharpness that we had at the beginning. Feather takes those edges, those kind of selected edges, and softens them and blurs them out. So if we crank up feather, oops, you can see that we end with this kind of like glowy selection, this kind of like halo effect around it. Contrast gives you a sharper line, so kind of opposite to feather. If we have feather cranked up a little bit, contrast is going to sharpen up those edges, give you a really sharp line. And then shift edge, I found this one quite useful. It's going to take the selection that you have and either push it outward, so shift it outward by a certain percentage, so give you a little bit of buffer, or kind of suck it inward, so push that selection inward. These are quite subtle changes. Hopefully you can see what's going on, but these are ultimately really helpful when you're working with a little bit more finicky selections. I would definitely recommend playing with these little sliders. They're pretty intuitive. That's pretty much all we need. Once you're happy with that, you can hit OK down in the bottom right hand corner to kind of get out of this little user interface. So I'll hit OK, and now we have that kind of like feathery version of our little astronaut. So that's a non-destructive workflow. Non-destructive meaning I can bring back parts of that original image by kind of painting them back into the scene. You can use the brush tool to paint things back in white, or you can just add white back into the picture in whatever way works for you. So I can add like a circular selection. I'll make a little circle, and I can fill it in with a little paint bucket with a fill color. Make that white. It doesn't seem to respond to any other colors than black and white. It's just really working with those brightness values. I'll hit OK, and now it's brought back that part of the image. Another little shortcut that I like to use is Shift Backspace. So if I have a selection, maybe I want to bring this back into the image while I have that little mask layer selected. Shift Backspace brings up that same dialog for filling in whatever you have selected. So I'm going to fill it in with white. It's a little preset that they have from the drop down here. I'll hit OK, and now it's back. And you can toggle between the two. Again, if I hit Shift Backspace and make it black, it's going to erase it from the image. Shift Backspace, 50% gray is going to bring it in kind of like half opacity. So I'll make that white again and hit OK and deselect. Now I'll go with a little astronaut circle situation. I'm going to delete this mask, select the subject again, and mask it one more time to bring him back to a normal state. So those are kind of the basics of selecting and cropping stuff out. If for whatever reason you're like, okay, fuck it, I actually really don't need to keep the rest of those pixels, another nice way to quickly select something and remove the background. So if I select the subject here, you can also press Control or Command J to duplicate a layer. So if I press Command or Control J, you can see it's made a new layer for me. It's kind of copied the information that I had selected and made a new layer with just that information in it. So that's another way to kind of Control C, Control V, but a little bit quicker. It's just going to be Control J. And that works for any layer. So if I want to delete my little astronaut and make a copy of the original image, you can make a copy or duplicate any layer just by pressing Control J. So if I have nothing selected, it's going to copy the whole thing. Okay, you could also use remove background from this little floating option here, remove background. I find that works best when there's people in a scene, but it's just one more kind of AI driven option for condensing it into one step. So selecting your object, selecting your little fella here, and masking out the background. That's going to be a non-destructive workflow. Okay, one more interesting selection tool that I've found super helpful for working with renderings is select and then sky. This one's also super new in Photoshop. I don't think this used to be a thing, but now it's able to scan your image and search for a sky. So select and then sky. It's going to look at your picture and pick out what it thinks the sky is, which is super cool. So that's one way to grab the sky. There's also an amazing tool in Photoshop that's pretty new as well. If you come up to edit, there's a new option called sky replacement. And this one's pretty crazy actually. So if I click sky replacement, you can see that blue sky after a while will turn into whatever I have selected from this dropdown. So it's not only scanning the image and figuring out what the sky is, it's replacing it with whatever you have selected from this picture here. So you can change the sky out really easily, which is interesting. I found it's actually pretty good, honestly. Some of the presets are a little goofy, but yeah, this might save you a little bit of time. And when I hit OK, you can see it makes a whole bunch of new layers for me. It brings in that sky, but it also plays with the lighting on the edge of the scene where it's meeting that sky, which is super cool. It's made this new folder with a bunch of kind of levels and hue and saturation lighting in there, which is interesting. So you can turn that on and off by clicking the little eyeball. And then foreground lighting, you can see it's actually adding stuff on top of our existing image to blend it in with that sky background a little bit more. So that's super cool. This is brand new in the newer versions of Photoshop, this sky replacement. But pretty interesting, something to keep an eye on for sure. Next, we're going to talk about just cleaning up and working with pieces of an image. So if I want to remove maybe like, I don't know, clean up parts of this facade, some of it's looking a little rusty. There's a couple different tools in Photoshop for cleaning up images or removing like marks or things you don't want to see. So I'm going to come down to the spot healing brush tool. It's this little band-aid icon here. And this one does pretty much what you think it would do. I'm going to bring the size of the brush a little down and then paint over some of these like quote unquote blemishes in the picture. And you can see what it's doing. It's just kind of like cleaning up those marks using information from the surrounding pixels. So it's going to try to blend in those pixels with whatever's around it. So that's quite helpful for cleaning up things that are dirty or spotted or whatever, or getting rid of this little creepy face in the window. It's pretty good. So the spot healing tool is really great. There's also the remove tool. So this is brand new, I think, in newer versions of Photoshop. This one's kind of crazy, actually. It can kind of remove entire people and things from your images. Again, it's going to be using that AI function, so probably not available in earlier versions of Photoshop. But I can try using the remove tool. I can try to get rid of this little, I don't know, what's that called? Traffic cone. You can see you paint on a little area and then it'll say removing area. So it's doing some AI math to try to figure out what should be there instead. Stay tuned. Doesn't usually take this long. Okay, whatever. This is taking too long. Anyway, it's a kind of tool that can go through and sometimes maybe it'll let me do it with these people. Let you remove people from an image. There we go. So those people have suddenly disappeared. This one is a destructive workflow. You can see that it didn't add anything over on my layers panel here. It's really just kind of like painted those people out of the scene. So if I hit Control Z and Control Shift Z, you can see that they're there and then they're gone. So this is pretty amazing. It's not perfect. Like, depending on the size of your image, it can sometimes fill it in with a little bit of some janky moves. But for the most part, this is actually a super kind of amazing and helpful tool. Another way you can access something similar is just by using actually the generative AI function inside of Photoshop. So let's say I want to maybe get rid of the company logo on top of the tower here. So I can make a little selection. Maybe I'll select the text up here and just click this generative fill button. So this is just the all-inclusive AI button inside of Photoshop. You can type in what you want to generate. Maybe we'll play around with an option later, but for now I'm just going to leave it blank, and that usually does the job for kind of getting rid of whatever's underneath. So I'll hit generate. It's going to chug for a second. And now you can see it's generated a couple different variations for me over on the right hand side here, which is pretty cool. You can see that sky replacement group is on top. So some of the lighting that it created for our spooky new sky involved that signage initially. So I'm just going to turn off our sky replacement, or you can move it underneath. I'm just going to turn it off. And now you can see all of those different generative fill options completely erased the signage. It's getting better, honestly. It's getting a little spooky. You have no idea how much harder it was to do this kind of shit before. You basically have to like paint in all of this little lines, or use the clone stamp tool. That's another little option you can use if you want a little bit more control than AI is giving you. The clone stamp tool lets you copy from part of an image. So if I press Alt or Option on a Mac, you should get this little crosshair cursor thing that shows up. That lets you click a part of an image that you want to copy. So maybe I'm interested in like this little texture that's going on here. So Option, click, and then I can go somewhere else on the picture and start painting those pixels over. You can see there's like a little plus sign down on the left-hand side where I initially sampled from. And then wherever I'm painting over top, that's showing up on the right-hand side, which is pretty cool. But that's old school now. Now we have generative fill stuff, so pretty interesting tools moving forward. Otherwise, the rest of these tools aren't super critical. Honestly, they're more for like touching up photographs or little graphics and stuff. So I'm not really going to talk about the rest of the tools going on down here. There are some tools for working with shapes, like you can add circles and stuff to your images. I really don't think Photoshop is the place to be doing stuff with like shapes and vectors for the most part. So we're not going to touch on this too much. Just know that you can add in like rectangles and shapes and stuff into your Photoshop scene. If you ever need to fill in like big blocks of color or what have you. It brings these in as shapes, so you can see the little icon on the thumbnail is a little bit different. So you should be able to still play with the fill and the stroke of these kinds of shapes. But do please note that Photoshop is a raster software. So we talked about that. Maybe we didn't talk about that yet on our first day. But a raster software is one that works with pixels. I'll touch on this a little bit more when we get to Illustrator. Raster images work with grids of pixels at a time, and vector images work with kind of mathematical geometries. So at essence, Photoshop works with pixels and isn't great for dealing with shapes because those shapes are inevitably going to get quite pixely at the end of the day. So just know that this kind of stuff is probably better suited to Illustrator, but we'll get to that in a couple classes. Otherwise, those are most of the basics. The last thing I'll kind of touch on is the crop tool here. So the crop tool, again, is one of those things that's gotten quite a bit better in the past couple of years in Photoshop. So this does exactly what you think it'll do. It does the same thing that your iPhone does when you go to crop a photo. I'm sure you've done this before. The crop tool brings up this little UI. You can click and drag the corners and hit yes when you want to accept those changes. The only things to note when you're dealing with the crop tool is the ratio specified up at the top here. There's a little drop down that has a couple of presets, as well as some presets that I've made for making images of a certain size. So you can use these presets if you want your image to be locked to certain proportions. But otherwise, this can just be kind of annoying because most of the time you want to kind of like free form crop your image to whatever size you want. And it doesn't let you do that unless you click clear here. So if you have a ratio locked in over on the top here and you don't want to deal with it anymore, just press clear. It'll delete that ratio and now you can kind of click and drag to whatever dimensions you like. Something else to keep in mind that's really important is this little option here, delete cropped pixels. So this is kind of like the same thing we're talking about with masks and a non-destructive workflow. By default, I don't think this is turned on, but I might be wrong. So you just really want to double check this. By default, when it's not on, I can crop the image, hit OK, and then if I want to make that image bigger again, the rest of that information is still there. So those pixels are still there if I want to make it bigger once again. But if you hit delete cropped pixels, so this little check mark up here, next time I go to crop it and I hit enter, when I go to make it bigger again, those pixels are gone. So delete cropped pixels does exactly what it says it's going to do. Basically just deletes everything after you crop it out. And again, that can be useful if you want to keep your file size down or if you really don't need the information outside of what you're cropping it to anymore. But I really advise against doing this most of the time because you never know when you need to make changes. So keep an eye on that, double check what's being cropped. And most of the time I would leave this unchecked. Another very cool thing about the newer aspects of Photoshop is the generative expand option. So if I make this image bigger and hit enter, I can use this generative expand option while I have crop selected. Oops, let me try that one more time. You can also just press C to get to the crop tool really quickly. So if I make this bigger than what I have available, I don't have any information for the rest of this scene. If you press generative expand down at the bottom here, it'll kind of fill in this image with whatever you tell it, or just in general, whatever it thinks is good. I found the prompts haven't been super good. Like I haven't been able to use the text super effectively in Photoshop to get a really good result. So I would proceed with caution. But otherwise, I'm just going to leave this blank and hit generate. And it does a really interesting job of filling in the spaces. I'm not sure how it'll do with like a city scene. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, like that's kind of a wacky output. But some of the options are better than the others. Like that's actually not bad. That one's probably one of the better ones. There's some weird shit going on here. Not perfect, obviously, but it's really, really great for if you have something like this kind of an image and you want it to be like you want a lot more sky in it. It's super good at generatively expanding the sky. So I found that to be really helpful if you have like a horizontal or landscape image and you want it to be portrait. I found that to be like saved my ass quite a few times. So definitely keep that in mind. Lots of cool stuff with the crop tool. Um, Otherwise, I think we touched on a couple little adjustment layers into Photoshop on our first class. But again, just in terms of a non-destructive workflow, when you're doing things like changing the saturation or brightness of an image, there are a couple ways to do it always in Photoshop. You can do it directly on the image. So if you come up to Image, and then adjustments. Oops, when I have a layer selected, image, adjustments. You can see here there's all of these options here. These are going to make those adjustments directly to that layer, and then it's going to be impossible to undo them, which is a little bit stressful and really not ideal if you want to be making changes. Um, but if instead you add in an adjustment layer, that's going to take those changes and kind of externalize them to um, an object or a layer that you can tweak after the fact and delete if it doesn't go very well. So I'd highly recommend working with adjustment layers instead of adjustments to the actual image. So you can come under layer and then new adjustment layer to access basically all of the same tweaks that you would want to make to an image itself, but add them in as a layer instead. So for example, if I want to play with the brightness and contrast of this image, I can add a new brightness and contrast adjustment layer. It'll bring up this little dialog, ask you what you want to call it. I just hit OK every time. And now you can see that there's a new layer existing on my stack over here. You can crank up the brightness, crank up the contrast, and turn that on or off without damaging the underlying image. And you can see, again, this is another example where the order of operations really matters. So the place or location of this brightness and contrast layer is really going to affect what is changed by it. So if this is down at the bottom, it's not going to affect anything because there's nothing below it to change. But if I click and drag it all the way to the top, now it's affecting every single layer underneath it. And so things look a little more cohesive. So that's an adjustment layer. You can also use masks with adjustment layers, which is really interesting. So maybe I want to make my little astronaut black and white. There's a couple different ways we can do that. So the first way is what we talked about in our first class, actually. If you hit Alt or Option on a Mac and hover over the bottom of that black and white layer when it's directly on top of that little astronaut layer, when I click, you can see that it automatically applies it to just the layer that's just below it, which is really helpful. So that's one way to make only one layer black and white. Or I can use masks. So I can select my little astronaut using the Magic Wand tool, the Object Select tool, or there's a nice little shortcut that I found really helpful in Photoshop to select whatever the shape of a mask is. And that's by pressing Command on a Mac, I think Control on a PC, and then clicking on that layer mask itself. You can see when you hit Control or Command and then click on that little layer mask icon, you can see it makes the selection of whatever the mask is selecting. So that little astronaut gets outlined immediately when you hit Control or Command and then click on that little thumbnail. So now I can come back up to that black and white layer, and I can either kind of paint everything black and then paint in the selection white, or I can do one step shorter and paint everything black that I don't want to keep. So I'm going to select the inverse, so Control or Command Shift I. Now I'm selecting everything outside of the astronaut. I'm on my black and white layer. I'm clicking on the little mask thumbnail here. And I'm going to fill that in with black. So everything outside of the astronaut, I'm going to paint black so that we don't see it. We don't see the effect of that black and white mask. So to fill it in, I'll hit Shift Backspace, fill it in with black. Keep an eye on that little thumbnail. You can see when I hit OK, now everything I've painted in the black is back in color, so it's no longer black and white, except for that little astronaut that we had selected, which remains in black and white. So I think that's it. I think that's all I'm going to cover in this tutorial. So other than that, we'll touch on how to use these techniques for working with outputs from 3D modeling software next class. So we'll start to merge exports from Rhino, some kind of basic rendering stuff, and bring it into Photoshop and look at how we can play around with collage in Photoshop a little more effectively. So I'll leave it at that. Please shoot me an email if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you next class. Sweet. Thank you, guys.